The first email went out at 6 minutes past midnight, and by morning it had been forwarded to the city, the property management company, and a man named Del Pruitt, who owned half the commercial frontage on that side of Larkwood Avenue. The subject line read Noise Complaint, all capitals, the way a man types when he believes the volume of his font carries weight. The body listed 3 motorcycles, 2 engines idling past 11, and 1 accusation that the block had become unsafe for decent families. Walter Huntz read it on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, and he did not yet understand that he had just signed his name to the worst decision of his retirement. He was 68 years old. He had lived on Larkwood for 19 years, in a narrow 2-story with peeling blue trim and a wheelchair ramp. He had built himself the year his wife stopped walking. Vivian was gone 3 winters now. The ramp remained because he could not bring himself to tear out the last thing he had made for her. He kept the porch swept. He kept the curtains drawn after dark. And lately he kept a list in a spiral notebook on the kitchen table of every sound that came from the old transmission shop 2 doors down, where the men in leather had set up their meeting hall 8 months ago. He had counted 41 entries in that notebook. Engines. Boots on gravel. The metal scrape of a garage door at hours no garage door should move. Each entry had a date and a time written in his small, careful hand, the hand of a man who had spent 30 years keeping books for a freight company before his knees gave out. 11:40, 12:10, 1 in the morning on a Thursday. He had even noted the weather, as if the rain mattered, as if a judge would someday read these pages and find the cold front significant. He told himself he was protecting his property value. He told himself a man had a right to quiet. He told himself a great many things in that notebook, in the margins, in the dead hours when sleep would not come, and the house was too large and too silent around him. What he did not write down, because he did not know it yet, was the reason those men were awake at midnight, and why their headlights swept his street in slow, careful passes. He had decided somewhere in those 41 entries what the noise meant. He had decided it meant menace, and a man who has decided what a thing means stops looking at the thing itself. The notebook had started innocently enough. The first week the transmission shop reopened under its new owners, Walter had simply been curious, the harmless curiosity of a widower with too many empty hours. He had watched from the porch the way he watched the birds. At the feeder, Vivian had hung. But curiosity. In a lonely man curdles easily into suspicion, and suspicion writes things down, and the things written down begin to seem like evidence, and evidence wants a verdict. By the 40th entry, Walter Huntz had tried the men 2 doors down and found them guilty, and he had never once spoken a word to a single one of them. The reply to his email did not come from the men in leather. It came from Del Pruitt, and it came fast. Pruitt owned the strip. He owned the laundromat, the vacant unit that used to be a florist, the lot behind the transmission shop, and the paper on 3 of the houses on Larkwood, including, Walter would soon learn, the mortgage that a younger family 2 doors down was 4 payments behind on. Pruitt drove a pearl-white sedan with dealer plates that changed every few months. He wore golf shirts in colors that did not exist in nature. He had a way of standing too close when he spoke, close enough that a man could smell the mint he chewed to cover the coffee, and a way of using a first name 3 times in a single conversation, as if friendship were a thing that could be installed by repetition. And when he read Walter's complaint, he saw not a nuisance, but an opening. because Del Pruitt had been trying to empty that block for 2 years, and the men in the transmission shop were the only things standing in his way. It had taken Pruitt a decade to learn that the cheapest property in any city is property nobody wants to live near. He had learned it young, watching his own father lose a house to a bank for the price of a single bad season, and he had decided then that he would never be on the losing end of fear again. He would be the one who manufactured it. A block that felt dangerous emptied itself, and an emptied block could be bought for the price of the family's panic, and a bought block could be cleaned, renamed, and sold to people who would pay triple for the privilege of pretending it had always been safe. He had done it twice already, 2 streets over, in neighborhoods that now had coffee shops where the corner markets used to be. Larkwood was meant to be his third. He had the paper. He had the patience. He had everything except a street that would cooperate with being afraid. And the reason it would not cooperate was parked 2 doors down from Walter Haunt's, idling at midnight, walking a fence line. Walter knew none of this on the morning the trouble started. He knew only that a white sedan pulled to his curb at 9, and a man in a lavender golf shirt climbed out with a clipboard and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Hans," Pruitt said, "I want to thank you, genuinely. You may be the only sane man left on this street." Walter set down his coffee. Something in the man's warmth made his stomach tighten, the way still water tightens before a current shows itself. "I just want it quiet," Walter said. "Of course you do, and I'm going to make it quiet." Pruitt tapped the clipboard. "Unquote. That building they're in. Code violations going back to the previous tenant. Occupancy, fire suppression, the works. With a documented neighbor complaint, a real one, signed, 'The city has to act.' They've been ignoring me." "They won't ignore you." He held out a pen. "I just need your statement on the record. Make it official." The pen hung in the air between them. Walter looked at it. He thought about the 41 entries in his notebook, and the engines at midnight, and the way his late wife used to say that a man should be careful what he wishes for because the world has a long memory and a short patience for the lazy kind of justice. He did not take the pen. Not that morning. "I'll think on it," he said. Pruitt's smile thinned by a single degree. "Don't think too long. Buildings like that, they attract a certain element. You've seen them. Leather, loud. The kind of men who don't answer to anybody." He climbed back into the sedan. "A man your age, alone on this block. You want neighbors who will watch out for you, not neighbors who watch you." The sedan pulled away. Walter stood on his ramp a long time after it was gone. What he could not have known was that the white sedan, 2 blocks down, slowed in front of a small gray house with a tricycle in the yard, and that Del Pruitt looked at that house the way a man looks at a thing he intends to take. The men in the transmission shop called themselves the Iron Verdict, and their meeting hall had a steel door, a hand-painted sign with a closed fist inside a wheel, and a reputation on Larkwood that ran exactly as far as rumor could carry it. The neighbors said they ran guns. The neighbors said they were a front for something. The neighbors said a great many things, none of which were true, because the truth was both quieter and stranger than rumor could manage. Their president was a man named Aurelio Banks, called Reverend, not for any pulpit he had stood behind, but for the way he could end an argument with a single sentence and a long silence after it. He was 61, heavy-set and slow-moving, with a gray beard. He kept squared off at the collarbone and forearms inked solid to the wrist. He had buried 2 brothers and 1 son, and he had not raised his voice in 11 years because he had learned that the men who needed to raise their voices were the men who could not be trusted to keep their word. He had worked 22 years as a long-haul driver before his back retired him to the chair at the head of the table, and he ran the club the way he had run a rig across the mountain passes in winter, slow on the descents, never trusting the brakes, always reading the road 3 turns ahead. The men who rode with him were not what Larkwood imagined. There was a plumber. There was a retired school teacher who had buried a daughter to a drunk driver the courts let walk. There was a man who fixed clocks, and another who drove a forklift at the cannery, and a third who had come back from 2 tours overseas and found that the only quiet he could stand was the quiet on the far side of an engine. They were not angels, and they did not pretend to be. Some of them had records. All of them had reasons. What held them together was not menace, but a single shared conviction, learned the hard way by every man at that table, that the official world would not come when you called it, and so you had better build a world that would. The iron verdict had come to Larkwood for a reason no one on the block had thought to ask about. 8 months back, a girl named Priya Okafor, 9 years old, daughter of the family, in the small gray house with the tricycle, had been followed home from the bus stop. Not once, 3 times, a car that idled, a man. The first time she had told her mother, and her mother had told her she was imagining it, because that is what frightened parents tell frightened children when the alternative is too large to hold. The second time, Priya had run the last block with her backpack slapping against her spine and her breath tearing in her chest, and she had not imagined the sound of an engine keeping pace with her on the parallel street. The third time, the man had rolled his window down and said her name. Her name. A name he had no business knowing. Her mother, Naomi, had called the police, and the police had taken a report, and the report had gone into a drawer, and the car had come back the next week. The officer had been polite. He had written things on a clipboard. He had said the words about how they would keep an eye out, the words that mean a file and not a promise, and then he had driven away, and the street had been exactly as unguarded as it was before he came. Naomi Okafor had Her brother rode with the iron verdict, and when official protection proved to be a piece of paper in a drawer, the club did the only thing its code understood. It put itself between the child and the dark. They did not ask permission. They did not file a counter-report. They simply began that same night to be awake on Larkwood Avenue at the hours when the dark does its work, and they had not stopped for 240 nights. That was the noise Walter Hantz had been writing down in his spiral notebook. The engines at midnight were the patrol. The headlights, sweeping his street in slow passes, were 2 men making sure the car that idled never idled again. The boots on gravel were a rotation changing shifts, so that no hour of any night on Larkwood went unwatched. They had never said a word about it to anyone. The code did not require thanks. The code required only that the thing get done. Walter learned a piece of this on a Tuesday, when the younger Okafor child, Priya, knocked on his door selling raffle tickets for her school. She had a gap in her front teeth and a careful, watchful way of standing slightly behind the porch rail, as if she had been taught to keep something solid between herself and a stranger. She held the ticket book against her chest like a shield. Her sneakers were the kind that lit up when she shifted her weight, and she shifted often, never quite still, a child who had learned to keep her feet ready. Walter bought 4 tickets he did not want, and counted out the dollars slow, so she would not have to rush, and asked her what the raffle was for. "A field trip," she said. "To the aquarium." She had never seen the ocean, and the aquarium was as close as a girl on Larkwood was likely to get. As she turned to go, he asked, because he was lonely and the words came out before he could stop them, whether the motorcycles down the street ever frightened her. The girl looked at him as if he had asked whether the sun frightened her. "They walk me home," she said. "Mr. Banks says nobody touches our street." She considered him a moment longer. This old man on his porch, she had clearly been told something about, because children are told everything. "You're the one who counts them," she said. It was not unkind. It was simply true, the way children's observations are simply true. "Tully says you're scared. He says scared people aren't bad people. They're just people who haven't figured out who their friends are yet." And then she was gone down the ramp and across the grass, her sneakers flashing red with every step, and Walter stood in his doorway, holding 4 raffle tickets and the first cold edge of a feeling he would spend the next 2 weeks trying to argue himself out of. He did not sign Pruitt's statement, but he did not throw it away either. It sat on his kitchen table next to the spiral notebook, and the 2 papers seemed to watch each other across the wood grain, and Walter ate his dinners in the narrow space between them. Del Pruitt did not wait for Walter to decide. Pruitt had built a career on not waiting. He filed a complaint himself, with Walter's address listed as the originating party and a signature line that Walter had never signed, and he leaned on a contact in the city's code office who owed him a favor from a rezoning 2 summers back. A notice went up on the steel door of the transmission shop. 30 days to remedy a list of violations that would cost more than the club could raise or vacate. The clock started on a Friday, and on that same Friday the car came back. It was a sedan, dark, with the kind of anonymous quality that costs money to achieve. It came down Larkwood at the hour when the school bus let out, and it slowed at the corner where Priya Okafor stepped down onto the curb. The man inside had a phone up, the way a man holds a phone when he is not making a call, but recording one. He had done this before. He had been paid to do this before. And he had been told by a man in a lavender golf shirt that the bikers were on their way out, and the street would soon belong to people who understood how things worked. He was wrong about the timing. He was wrong because a man named Tully Vance, the club's sergeant-at-arms, was 40 feet away in the open bay of the transmission shop with a socket wrench in his hand, and Tully Vance had spent 8 months learning the exact sound of a car slowing where no car should slow. Tully was 44, lean and economical, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and a single white scar that split his right eyebrow. He did not run. Running frightens a child. He walked, unhurried, out of the bay and down the sidewalk, and he placed himself between the dark sedan and the girl. And he did nothing else. He did not shout. He did not raise a hand. He simply stood, arms loose at his sides, and looked at the man behind the glass with the flat patience of a man who has all night and no fear left to spend. The phone lowered. The sedan idled. For a long moment the street held its breath. Then the car pulled away from the curb, slow, deliberate, and Tully memorized the plate the way he memorized everything, and he walked Priya the last 100 feet to her door, and he tipped his head to her mother on the porch, and he said nothing about what had nearly happened because there was nothing yet to say. Walter Hauntz saw all of it from his porch. He saw the car slow. He saw the man stand. He saw the girl reach her door. And he understood in the slow way a man understands a thing he has been refusing to see, that the noise in his notebook and the safety of that child were the same thing wearing 2 faces. He went inside and he looked at Pruitt's statement on the kitchen table, and for the first time he read it as the weapon it was. The next morning he walked down to the transmission shop. It was the longest 200-foot walk of his life. The steel door stood open. Inside, the air smelled of motor oil, coffee, and old leather, and a dozen men in cuts looked up from a long, scarred table as the old man in the cardigan stepped across their threshold. Walter had rehearsed nothing. He stood in the doorway, small and gray and out of place, and he said, the only true thing he had. I think I did something stupid, he said, and I think it's about to hurt that little girl. Reverend Banks rose from the head of the table. He did not hurry. He crossed the floor and stopped in front of Walter and looked at him for a long, quiet moment. And then he pulled out a chair, the nearest one, and set it down with a scrape that was the only loud sound in the room. Sit, Banks said. Tell me all of it. Walter sat, and he told them all of it. The email at midnight, the white sedan, the lavender shirt, the pen he had not taken, and the statement Pruitt had filed under his name without his signature. The 30-day notice on their door. He told them about the dark car that afternoon and the man with the phone. And when he got to that part, the room changed. It did not get louder. It got stiller the way the woods go still before weather, and Walter felt the stillness press against his skin. He told them about the notebook, too. He did not have to. No one had asked. But the truth had a momentum once he started it, and so he told them about the 41 entries, the dates and the times and the noted weather, and the way he had tried them and convicted them without ever once walking down to say hello. He expected anger. He braced for it the way a man braces for a wave he sees coming. Instead, a heavy-set rider near the middle of the table, a man with reading glasses, pushed up into white hair, made a low sound that might almost have been a laugh, and said that his own mother had kept a list like that of the family next door for 30 years, and they had buried her, never knowing that the man she feared had shoveled her walk every snowfall. Before dawn, so she would not fall, nobody else laughed, but the stillness softened by a degree, and Walter understood that he was not being judged in this room half as harshly as he had judged himself. You wrote down our engines, said a younger man near the end of the table. He had a laptop open in front of him and a nervous energy the others did not share. His name was Cody Reyes, and the club called him Switch, because he could find anything that had ever been typed, photographed, or filed. 41 nights you logged us, like we were the problem. I did, Walter said. I thought you were. And now? Walter looked at the closed fist inside the wheel, painted on the wall. Now, I think I was watching the wrong street, Banks. Let the silence sit. Then he asked the question that mattered. Why come tell us? You could have stayed on your porch. Let it play out. Pruitt empties the block. You get your quiet. Walter's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat on the scarred table to still them. Because my wife is buried out at Rest Haven, he said, and she would have walked down here the first night, and I let 3 winters go by being a coward on a porch. I'm too old to start the 4th one the same way. Banks looked at him a long time. Then he nodded once, and the nod traveled around the table like a current, and Walter Huntz understood that he had just been let inside something he did not yet have a name for. What followed was not what Walter expected. He had braced for violence. He had braced for men who answered a threat with a louder threat. Instead, Switch turned his laptop around and began, in a low, flat voice, to lay out everything the club already knew and everything it was about to learn. And Walter realized he was watching a different kind of weapon entirely. The dark sedan's plate came back to a leasing company. The leasing company came back to a holding entity. The holding entity, 3 shells deep, came back to a name Switch had already seen once before on the deed transfers for 2 of the foreclosed houses on Larkwood. Del Pruitt, the same man who had pressed a pen at Walter and filed a complaint under his name and put a notice on the club's door, was paying the man in the car that had slowed 3 times at a 9-year-old girl's bus stop. "He's not trying to clean up the block," Switch said. "He's trying to scare it empty. Every family that runs, he buys the paper cheap. The Okafors are 4 payments behind because somebody's been calling their lender pretending to be them, missing payments on purpose, trashing their credit. I found the call logs. He's manufacturing the foreclosure he plans to profit from. The girl getting followed isn't separate from the real estate play. It's the same play. Make the street feel dangerous, make the families leave, buy what they leave behind." "And the man in the car?" Walter asked. "Hired? Pruitt's been running him for months. He's the danger Pruitt then sells the neighborhood protection from." Switch's jaw tightened. "Except we got here first. So now he's trying to remove us with a code complaint, because as long as we're on this block, his scary street keeps stubbornly refusing to be scary." Walter sat with that. The full architecture of it settled over him slow and cold. He had been recruited without knowing it into the cleanest part of a dirty plan. His complaint had been the respectable signature Pruitt needed, the decent neighbor whose word the city could not ignore, the human face on a scheme that ran on fear and foreclosure paper. He had been the alibi. The good man whose name made the bad thing looked legal. "What do you do now?" Walter said. It was not really a question, Banks answered. "Now we do what we do. We don't burn his house down, we don't break his legs. Men like Pruitt, they're not afraid of pain. They're insured against pain. They're afraid of being seen." He looked at Switch. "He built this in the dark. We turned the lights on. The plan took shape over the following week, and Walter, to his own astonishment, was in the middle of it. Not as a soldier. As a witness. As the one piece of the puzzle that gave everything else its weight, because a real complaint signed by a real neighbor could become, with one revision, a real retraction and a real account of how that signature had been forged and weaponized. Switch built the file. Patiently, the way Banks did everything, he pulled the call logs that showed the spoofed calls to the Okafors' mortgage lender, traced to a number that billed back through the same holding entity. He pulled the leasing paper on the dark sedan. He pulled the deed transfers, the foreclosure filings, the pattern of cheap buys following hard on the heels of families who had complained, just like Walter, of a danger they could not name. He pulled 4 other neighbor complaints, all filed in the past 2 years, all originating from addresses now owned by Del Pruitt, 2 of them signed by people who swore they had never signed anything at all. Walter sat with him through one long evening of it, at a card table dragged into the corner of the shop, a desk lamp throwing a cone of light over the printouts while the rest of the room went about its quiet business. He had expected the work to be exciting. It was not. It was slow and dull and relentless, a man reading numbers off a screen and matching them to numbers on a page. And Walter realized that this was the whole secret of it. Pruitt's power had always depended on no one being willing to do the dull, patient work of looking. He counted on the file in the drawer. He counted on the report nobody followed up. He counted on the tired clerk and the overworked officer, and the lonely old man on the porch who wrote things down but never walked them anywhere. The club's weapon was simply the refusal to be tired. They would look, they would keep looking, and what they found, they would not bury. They would hand it to daylight. "He thinks he's the only one who keeps records," Switch said, not looking up from the screen. Everybody keeps records. He just never met anybody willing to read his. And then Tully Vance found the man in the car. He did not find him with violence. He found him with a license plate and a patience that the man, whose name was Bram Tolliver, did not have. Tully and one other rider followed Tolliver to a bar 3 towns over, and they did not touch him, and they did not threaten him. Tully sat down across from him and set a single sheet of paper on the table. On it was everything: the plate, the payments, the leasing trail, the dates Tolliver had idled outside an elementary school, and at the bottom, in Switch's neat print, the name of the federal statute that turns following a child into a thing that does not get a second offense. "You've got a daughter," Tully said. It was not a guess. Switch had found her too. "She's 7. So here's the only thing I came to say. You can be the man who got paid to scare a little girl, or you can be the man who told the truth about who paid him. Pruitt's going down either way. The only question is whether you're standing next to him when he does." Tolliver was, underneath the money, a coward, the way most men who take such jobs are cowards. He looked at the sheet of paper for a long time. Then he asked for a pen, the same gesture Pruitt had offered Walter, but reversed, now the pen passing the other way, toward confession instead of complicity. He wrote it all down: who hired him, what he was paid, what he was told. He signed it with a hand that shook the way Walter's had shaken on the scarred table, and Tully folded it once and put it inside his cut, and he stood and left without another word, because the code did not require gloating any more than it required thanks. The night before they moved, Walter could not sleep. He sat on his porch in the dark, and at 1:45 he heard the engines. The same engines he had logged 41 times in his spiral notebook, and this time he did not reach for the notebook. He watched the 2 headlights sweep his street in their slow, careful pass, the shepherds walking the fence line, and he understood that they had been guarding his block all along, his block, the one he had tried to have them removed from. And his throat closed and his eyes stung, and he was glad of the dark, so that no one could see an old man cry on his own porch over the noise he had once tried to silence. In the morning, Reverend Banks knocked on his door. Behind him, at the curb, stood a row of motorcycles, chrome catching the early light, riders waiting with the patience of men who have already won and are only waiting for the loser to find out. "You don't have to come," Banks said. "Your name's already on the file. You've done your part." Walter took his cardigan off the hook by the door and pulled it on. "I signed a lie about you on a Tuesday," he said. "I'll sign the truth in person." The county administration building was glass and flat daylight. Everything Pruitt's world was, and the transmission shop was not. Del Pruitt was there for a scheduled hearing on the code violation. He had engineered lavender shirt, traded for a charcoal suit, a lawyer at his elbow, a smile already practiced for the moment the bikers' building would be condemned out from under them. He had requested a public session. He had wanted witnesses. He had wanted, Walter understood later, to be seen winning, because being seen was the whole engine of the man. He got his witnesses. When Pruitt's matter was called, it was not Pruitt's lawyer who rose first. It was a quiet man in a cardigan, and beside him a heavy-set man with a squared gray beard, and behind them, filling the back of the chamber in a wall of leather and stillness, the iron verdict, who had broken no law to be there, and so could not be removed for being there. Walter walked to the front. He set Switch's file on the table, and in a voice that did not shake, because somewhere in the last 2 weeks the shaking had stopped, he told the room the truth. He had not signed the complaint. His name had been forged onto it. He had come to swear that under oath and to submit, with it, a record of who had forged it and why. He laid it out the way Switch had laid it out for him, plain and sequential and impossible to look away from the spoofed calls, the leasing trail, the deed transfers, the pattern of frightened families and cheap buys. The man hired to follow a child. The confession of that man, signed and dated, naming Del Pruitt. Pruitt's lawyer objected. The chair overruled him because the documents were real and the witness was real, and the only thing in the room that was not real was the complaint Pruitt had built his morning around. And then Walter watched the thing the club had promised. He watched the lights come on. He watched Del Pruitt, who was not afraid of pain because he was insured against pain, discover that he had no insurance against being seen. The color left the man's face in stages. The practiced smile came apart at the corners. He reached for the architecture that had always held him up, the connections, the favors, the comfortable certainty that men like him do not answer to anyone, and he found that the architecture was made of the same dark his scheme had run on, and the lights were on now, and the dark was gone. He stood up too fast, knocking his chair. "This is harassment," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "These people, these criminals, you're going to take their word over a property owner, over a taxpayer." He turned to the chamber, to the wall of leather at the back, and he found no rescue there, only stillness, only the flat, patient eyes of men who had all the time in the world. "You don't know what you're doing," he said to no one, to everyone. "You don't know who I am." "We do," said Reverend Banks. It was the first time he had spoken, and his voice did not rise. It filled the room the way deep water fills a hull. "We've known for 8 months. We were just waiting for the day you'd say it out loud where everyone could hear." Del Pruitt fled into the blinding daylight outside the glass doors, and his lawyer gathered the papers that no longer meant anything. And the matter of the transmission shop's code violation was, the chair announced, withdrawn pending a referral of the submitted documents to the district attorney, and, given their nature, to the federal authorities whose statute Switch had printed at the bottom of the page. Pruitt's world reasserted nothing. The white sedan was gone from the curb by the time the rest of them walked out. It did not end in a courtroom because that is not where these things end. The federal matter would grind for a year. The fraud charges, the foreclosure scheme, the man who followed children for hire and the man who paid him, all of it would move through the slow official machinery that had once kept Walter's first complaint in a drawer, and now, with enough light on it, could not look away. But the part that mattered, the part that was real, ended on Larkwood Avenue. The Okafors kept their house. Switch had documented the spoofed calls thoroughly enough that the lender reversed the missed payment marks and restored the family standing, and the small gray house with the tricycle in the yard stayed the small gray house with the tricycle in the yard. Naomi Okafor brought a dish of jollof rice down to the transmission shop the following Sunday, and her brother the rider ate 3 plates, and Priya sat on a workbench swinging her legs and beating Switch at a card game, while a dozen men in leather pretended not to be watching her win. And Walter Hans kept his porch swept. But the curtains stayed open after dark now. Some evenings the engine still woke him, the patrol still running its slow passes, because a code that protects a child does not stop the day the threat is removed. It becomes the shape of the street. One night near the end of summer, Reverend Banks walked up Walter's ramp, the ramp Walter had built for a wife who could not walk, and he set a small object on the porch rail. It was a patch. Not a member's cut, nothing that made Walter something he was not. It was a simple thing, a closed fist inside a wheel. The club's own mark, the kind they gave to the rare outsider the club counted as its own. "You don't ride," Banks said. "You don't need to. But this street's ours to watch, and you're on it. And now everybody who matters knows it." He paused at the top of the ramp. "Your wife would have walked down here the first night. That counts for more than you think." He went back down the ramp and out to the curb where the bikes waited, and the engines turned over. One by one, and the sound of them rolled down Larkwood Avenue and into the dark, and Walter Hantz stood on his porch and listened to the noise he had once written down in a spiral notebook as a thing to be stopped. It did not sound like noise anymore. It sounded like a fence line being walked. It sounded like a promise kept in the only language some promises can be kept in. He picked up the patch and turned it over in his old hands, the closed fist inside the wheel, and he thought of Vivian, and of the 3 winters he had wasted being afraid of the wrong thing, and he thought that a man is never too old to walk down a street he should have walked down years ago. He set the patch on the kitchen table where the forged complaint and the spiral notebook had once watched each other across the wood grain. Both of those were gone now. The notebook had gone into the trash. The complaint had gone into a federal file. Only the patch remained, the closed fist inside the wheel, catching the last of the kitchen light. Outside, the engines faded down the avenue and turned the corner and went quiet. And the quiet that came after was not the empty, quiet Walter had once begged the city for. It was the quiet of a street with someone awake at the edge of it. It was the quiet of a man who had finally chosen the right side of his own front door. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. And for the first time in 3 winters, he slept all the way through the night, and he did not dream of being alone. If this story moved you, if you have ever discovered that the people you feared were the ones standing guard, take a moment to sit with that feeling, and if it meant something, leave a word below and stay a while. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.